Medicine evolves one story at a time. Here's one worth telling. This is History Taking. So you know the movie Footloose back in 1984? How a teenager moves from Chicago to a small town and dancing is banned because it's seen as dangerous and rebellious, but they dance anyway. There's a similar story in history, but instead of dancing being banned because it's dangerous, it's because people literally couldn't stop dancing in the town. People were dancing out in the streets for days until their feet even bled and they collapsed from exhaustion, and no one really knew what was going on. Most of what we know from these events came from this 19th century physician and historian named Justus Friedrich Karl Hecker. Hecker wrote a book called The Dancing Mania of the Middle Ages. He was a trained physician educated at University of Berlin, and he was trying to research this from a clinical perspective, and he mapped out the story as best as he could using city chronicles, sermons, physician notes, municipal records, eyewitness accounts. And before him, there were reports of these dancing plagues, but he was the first to really assemble them into this narrative. So what was going on? So basically between the 14th and 17th century, there were these outbreaks of uncontrollable dancing that were reported across Europe, specifically along the Rhine and Moselle River regions. And so this phenomenon was reported under a lot of different names. They talked about it as dancing plague, Chorea mania, St. Vitus's dance, St. John's dance. But there was a key feature in all of these where groups of people just felt compelled to dance involuntarily until they collapsed. The most famous outbreak occurred in Strasbourg in July of 1518. So there was one singular woman named Frau Troffea, and she apparently stepped out on the street and she just began to dance. No music. She just started unpromptedly dancing, but she began to dance for hours and days. At first, the neighbors laughed, and then they started to get a little uneasy. But the weird part is that as she continued to dance, other people began to join her in her dancing. And within days, dozens of people were dancing. By August, the estimates ranged from 50 to 400 people at the peak. They tried to stop, but when they tried, their bodies seemed to sort of betray them. Some were collapsing from exhaustion or dehydration or starvation, and some even mentioned deaths from heart attacks or strokes in the middle of all this. The true death toll remains unknown, but the fact of the matter is that this was happening, and city officials needed to respond. At first, they were confused, and so physicians proposed this explanation based on a humoral theory. So they believed that dancers suffered from excess body heat, aka hot blood, that needed to be released. So how do you release hot blood from your body? Well, maybe you work it out more, and they actually encouraged people to dance even more. So they built and opened up guild halls, they hired musicians out in the streets, and they let the public square become a sort of dance floor. People were even paid to hold up collapsing dancers so that they could keep moving, because their thought is, if you stop moving, the hot blood will accumulate, so you got to get it out of your system. And surprise, surprise, everything actually became worse. People became more committed to this dancing routine. The excess dancing didn't seem to get rid of the hot blood. And there's no real good explanation, and panic started to spread amongst the community. People began to believe that the dancers were actually cursed, and the curse was from St. Vitus. St. Vitus's feast specifically involved ritual dancing. And so in parts of Germany, they were like, well, people seem to be dancing ritually now, let's associate that with the priest, and maybe they're being punished. So the city reversed course here. They said, you know what, this is the exact opposite of what we were doing before. Instead of promoting the music, we'll ban music. Instead of promoting the dancing, we'll ban public dancing. And anyone who is afflicted with this issue is sent out to St. Vitus's shrine. And so they were sprinkled with holy water and subjected to ritual rites. Some reports say that they were dressed in these red shoes, and all these things were supposed to break this curse of St. Vitus. And by September of 1518, the outbreak began to end. And so later, writers claim that as many as 15 people died per day at the height of the outbreak. However, Strasbourg records do say that there wasn't necessarily a burial surge, and there aren't official mortality counts. So perhaps the dancing till you die is more dramatized from later historians, but it is well documented that people were suffering, they were collapsing, they were incapacitated, and they needed medical care. The most interesting part is that Strasbourg is not this isolated case. We've seen this across time and space. We've seen this in Saxony in the 11th century, Central Europe in the 14th to 17th centuries, at religious festivals or pilgrimages, in areas of famine or stress or social upheaval. And we see this sort of social pattern. So let's talk about some of those other places. So in southern Italy, in Apulia, we saw a phenomenon known as tarantism. So there, you had this uncontrollable movement that was blamed on spider bites, specifically the tarantula. Dancing wasn't the problem, it was actually the cure. So you had this fast, rhythmic music, what we know as the tarantella, that was played, and people danced until they were exhausted. And the idea was similar to what they said before, but rather than associating it with this humoral bad blood, they just thought, oh, if you completed the dance, it would recover. And so people experienced this agitation, this fever, this trembling, this altered behavior, and they were like, let's dance to get it out of here. And it came and it went in that area of southern Italy. And it's not really something that's isolated to the medieval times. In 1962, what is now known as Tanzania, something similar happened. At a girls' boarding school near Lake Victoria, 3 students just began to dance. And within weeks, those 3 students led to 95 of the nearly 160 students that were affected. Teachers themselves were not, but the students were. And the episodes would kind of last hours to days at a time. And it got so bad that they actually had to shut down the school. What's interesting is that while Strasbourg was isolated to Strasbourg, and from what I have seen, Apulia, Italy was isolated to Apulia, Italy, these episodes of dancing spread to nearby villages and other schools. And there are reports that about 1,000 people were affected over the 18 months. So, what is really going on, right? Like, at the time, in medieval times, they were focused on things like possession, divine punishment, and maybe like a moral failure. Oh, you're being punished for these sins that you committed. And so, to address that, you have to absolve yourself of whatever sin you're doing, or get forgiveness in the eyes of God, right? Or get exorcised from whatever you're being possessed with, right? In order to end the outbreak. And they didn't really think about the neurology at the time because that wasn't really a focus back then. Nowadays, we can think about the neurology and think about something called chorea. Chorea, not to be confused with the country that produces K-pop. It's an involuntary movement disorder. So it can look dance-like. You flail your arms and legs around at times. But the thing about neurology is that if this is a neurological basis, it shouldn't really spread socially, right? There's no virus that's bouncing around causing people to dance. It doesn't really line up like that. We can consider something called ergot poisoning. So ergot poisoning actually causes hallucinations and pain. But again, you see the synchronized behavior that's occurring through the social population. And so that doesn't really fit the epidemiology as well. And that's where we get to what we would call mass psychogenic illness. You might have heard about this before in the term mass hysteria, right? So mass psychogenic illness basically indicates that there are real physical symptoms that are being presented, which we do see with the dancing, right? And that we have this real suffering. And there isn't a deliberate faking of the symptoms, but you see these outbreaks that occur in communities that are pretty close together, that have some sort of significant stress or perceived threat, and there are these strong social narratives. And we saw that, right? So in Strasbourg, we had this strong social narrative of, oh, this maybe is associated with St. Vitus, and people see one person dance and monkey see, monkey do, and you kind of like spread this all around, right? Tanzania at the time was going through this social upheaval, and you see the kids spreading across, which also explains why it doesn't necessarily affect the adults, because the adults weren't as susceptible to this dancing as the kids. Symptoms are spreading through this expectation, and maybe the adults weren't as susceptible to that expectation. And the brain isn't inventing these symptoms randomly either. Like I said, it's a monkey see, monkey do type thing, where you see this reflected behavior and you try to copy it without even realizing it. In medieval Europe, we saw that with sin and punishment. In Italy, we saw that with the association with the spider venom and the tarantulas. In Tanzania, it was the laughter and running of kids that just spread it across the villages. So, yeah, overall, this is an illness, but it's a psychogenic one. It's not something that can be cured with a pill. It's something that lives in the communication of the society that we're in. The way the symptoms are explained kind of shapes how they appear in society. And so meaning of the symptom or interpretations of the symptom kind of becomes this vector of transmission of the illness in and of itself. The people of Strasbourg weren't pretending. The people of Tanzania weren't pretending. What changed wasn't biology at all. It was more of a social biology, and they went across the story that was given to them. And so under the right conditions, it's pretty interesting to see how the human nervous system doesn't just respond as an individual case. We actually can synchronize with others, and sometimes that leads us to dancing. So, yeah, this has been History Taking. Thank you for listening. Want to talk about the latest episode or give us feedback on how to make the show better? Feel free to reach out on our Discord in the show notes below. Want to send support? Feel free to engage with our Patreon. This is just a passion project for us, but we're always looking for ways to make this better. Thanks for listening.